Great. Thanks, Howard. Thanks, everybody, for your time again today. It's wonderful to see everybody. And up in Johannesburg, it's an amazing day. Blue skies, great weather. So I hope the same for everybody else around the country and wherever else you're from. Canada, I hope the weather's pretty good there as well. But thanks again to everybody. And if I may just open up, just thinking about last week's discussion and looking at the picture, maybe Howard, and to the speakers today, just a question from my side. How do we drive? I think important is we hear a lot about why, we hear about what, and I know that's pretty consistent with the DMBOK. And but the flavor that we try and drive through the specialist how-to courses and all that is exactly what I just said. How do we do all of this? So my question is, around how to drive change in ethics. Do we read books on ethics, governance, change? Do we just tell people what to do? But I know through discussion with Howard, the word awareness comes up often. And so just positioning the question and a bit of the answer to Howard is a catchphrase for today: awareness, awareness, awareness. So let's really get our teeth stuck into the awareness side of things. And how do we do that, Howard? How do we drive awareness? How do we bring awareness? How do we structure it, et cetera, et cetera? So thanks again. Thanks for those who prepared for today. And looking forward to it. Over to you.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you very much. I just wanted to share a testimony, and I don't want Costa to laugh too much, but it must be about 5 years ago when I joined Dama International board for a very brief period as the ethics officer. And someone reached out to me and said, would you join as the ethics officer? I said, sure. I considered myself to be a moral person, a man of right standing. And I remember sitting in my first board meeting, and they were having this big long discussion, and I was getting involved, and someone said, but that's not ethical. And I had no idea what they were talking about and why they considered it to be not ethical. And this is something that's worried me from that point onwards, is that ethics is not an easy thing to detect. So you don't just read a book about maleficence and beneficence and all these things and then you got it. Okay. So this how-to on ethics, there's the section there and it's important, but how you actually make people aware of ethical conduct is about talking and discussing and asking questions. And we would like this session to be very much like that. And the session is specifically geared towards data scientists. And we believe that they are the people that will see the unethical behavior before anybody. Okay? So when the data scientists start to link data, to correlate data, and to work with data, they are the ones that are going to detect it. And I liked what, hopefully I get your pronunciation right, but I think it's Martin van der Heijden. He pointed out to us today on the talk about the source of criticism and being able to understand who it is, who shared the data, where did it come from, what's the authority, and it's about paying attention to the background, or what we like to refer to as the truth of the data, before we get to the meaning of the data. Okay, so before we start inferring, deducing, and elements like that, it is important that we establish truth. Okay, so today, please, I know that Costa and Christine have very much prepared a set of examples where they can share some of the concepts so that we can discuss it and so that you can understand it, and that would be helpful if you guys ask the questions or share the questions itself, and make sure that you understand and that we can elaborate, because just showing screens and things like that is only part of it. It's about applying it to your practice. So let's keep that on board. Now, I just wanted to take you through a manual, that a book that I got. These guys, Dara O'Brien and Catherine O'Keefe, were actually on the Dama board. There's Mark pointing to it. I have learned a lot from this book. And it is very helpful, and I would suggest you read it. They have lots of stories about Lego and what the different companies have done to establish this ethical culture and ethical practice within their organization. Okay. Now, the first thing that struck me, and we'll talk quite a bit about, and I don't know if you guys have listened to or heard a lot of, it's Kathy O'Neill on the weapons of mass destruction. She's fantastic at giving examples. We want to talk through some of those examples today just to share with you. And a lot of it is about feedback. Okay, a lot of it's about, if you look at the presentation that I've got at the moment, and I'm going to just focus on some areas. So sorry for me. So if I just focus on this area over here, it's about understanding the fact that we need to pay attention to the society that we live in, the organization, and we need the appropriate outcomes. We need to think about the outcomes, but we also need to understand the expectations of the stakeholders being in society and within the organization, and to get the feedback. Now, when I saw this thing, I thought, that's fantastic. That's exactly what I got to do. But I started to get into all sorts of trouble when applying it. Now, the topic gets quite interesting, because if we look at having automated feedback, so let's say we have a machine learning algorithm that's actually processing stuff and asking for feedback. How do we continually get feedback from the community to ensure that we're not doing harm before we do harm? Okay, so we want to be able to teach the machine, we want to be able to teach the outcomes that it's getting before the damage is created. Because, I mean, I think Costa, I like what Costa always talks about is, guys, you don't want to read about this in tomorrow's newspaper. You don't want to read about what you've done in your fancy AI and machine learning algorithm in tomorrow's newspaper in terms of how you've been affecting people. So you need to be proactive. You need to be asking questions. So how do we poll the community to get feedback? How do we do that, and how do we bring it into the algorithms? How do we bring the feedback into the algorithms? And that's not as easy as one thinks. And what struck me was, I was talking to a cousin who was at George Mason University in Washington. He's an anthropologist, and he was talking about how they teach ethics and the discussions that they have, and then also the sociologists. And there's this big debate in sociology about digital surveys and not getting the truth back from a digital survey, because the way people respond to a survey that's the digital one compared to the way they respond to a face-to-face survey is very different. And I certainly know that that's happened to me. I do respond differently. So they believe that the ground zero truth about the community and the feedback is when you talk to people. Can we afford to talk to people? That's a different discussion, and I haven't found an answer to that. Maybe Costa's got some ideas, but if we're going to get some digital feedback into this algorithm and the machine learning thing, how are we going to do it? How are we going to get the right feedback? So that's a challenge for all of us, and certainly for the data scientists that are involved in it, in doing some of this stuff. How do they get the right feedback? Now, one of the things that I also, in terms of answering Paul's question, is when you first of all start off with ethics in an organization, you'll find that the ethics has been moderated by individuals. Okay, so individuals control the ethics, and that's a dangerous place to be in, because we all operate at a different level of ethics. We all see things differently. Costa's got a great story about NASA, where they were forced by the project managers to deliver on time and to go ahead, irrespective of the fact that they didn't believe and they didn't trust the system. They were driven. And we get like that. I think all of us work on sprints, we work on the stuff, and we don't realize how much we bend to pressure, and we don't call it for what it is. So the major thrust, if you guys take anything back away from this discussion, is that we got to move away from individual moderation to situational or organizational moderation, and even feedback from the community, that the community starts to moderate us. Okay, this guys, it's not easy. It takes a lot of work, but it's something that we understand. How do we move one step forward? And this is just a set of slides that I put together in terms of what it takes to move up the different levels of maturity. So that EEIM book actually talks about the different levels of maturity that we know. You know, these are the 5 levels, and how do you increase the maturity? What do you need to do to improve the maturity of ethics? What do you need to focus on, and how do you measure yourself? So helpful to understand that backdrop on bringing ethics into your organization from a governance point of view, from a data science point of view. You need the normative structures, you need the referent models about how do you deal with data. So it's not just about the algorithm and the data set that's in front of you. There's more to it than that, and that's sort of what I think Martin van der Heerden was actually sharing with us, is that source criticism, that knowledge about the source, the domain that you're in, is more important than just the data and the factual elements that the data have. Okay. Are there any questions or observations on that before we start with the main presentation? I think we've got one. No, that's just any observations. Costa, anything you'd like to share? Anybody would like to share something? You guys
I was going to address. I was going to talk to. Can I talk to it now? I was going to talk to it at the end, but I'm happy to discuss it now.
Yes.
Yeah. Just firstly, Paul started about asking the questions about awareness, and clearly, yeah, awareness. It starts with awareness and keeping the conversation going, keeping it alive at every level. Yes. Because it is a responsibility of everybody in the organization. And there's a big, interesting debate that just having an ethics officer. A lot of the Nordics, mature organizations, are appointing ethics officers, but that sort of takes it away from people. It takes responsibility away from them, and you want to have that ethics conversation at every point along the way. Yes. So to Paul's point, there is an awareness drive. It is an education drive, and really, with ethics, you can't tell people what to do. I think to your point, Howard, it is such a subjective exercise. My background and the way I look at things, and what I think is reasonable is not reasonable to another person. So, but I think how you drive it is definitely to create an open, safe environment and to have diversity in your teams. You spoke about individual moderator versus the community. And I think the community increasingly is going to put pressure on us. There's public demand. They want to know, and they have a right to know. So that open culture within the organization to create that safe environment where we can say, look, I need to stop this process. I'm not happy. I need to discuss it. Maybe I'm slowing it down. Even if it goes about knowledge about the source, to stop everything down and have a safe environment to question in the organization. And you mentioned to have that feedback continuously, not just from your external stakeholders, but from your internally as well. And then about the point about sociology and people not telling the truth in surveys, I think when you talk to people, and that's what Ubuntu is saying, is let's engage with people, let's talk to people, let's involve and include people internally and externally. And the problem is when you ask people, you might not like what they have to say, and it gets messy. Let's face it, talking to people is a difficult process. It's time consuming, but I think it's critical. I mean, you have to do it. So I think those are just some of the points.
Okay. Thanks, Costa. All right.
Thanks, everybody, and good afternoon. It's Christine. I'm talking on the change management, data culture change, and where it overlaps with regards to this. Just to go back to the original point that Howard made, I think it would be beneficial for us to be a little bit more interactive and please share examples. I think the group sits with a huge amount of experience and knowledge. And sharing examples of ethical challenges would be very valuable to the group. So we're just saying, it's an open discussion. It's not a death by PowerPoint at this stage. But like we always do, just going back to the Damer wheel, what we're saying is the governance, culture change, and ethical principles are part of a rubber band that surround the Damer model, and for good reason, because it cuts across all knowledge areas, and people are not set in their ways. They respond differently, like we said earlier, ethically and behavior-wise, situationally dependent. So, there's not a model that we can flog that says one size fits all. People are generally unpredictable and unique. So that is why, driving the ethics and the data culture is kind of a moving target. But let's just look at those concepts. What is culture? Well, culture is shared values, beliefs, norms, and behaviors. And it's even more complex than that because it's multidimensional. And ethical behavior certainly links to that. It makes up a component of who the person is. And when I say it's multidimensional, the green and red aspects really talk to the person. So green, I'm a person, my age defines me, my gender, my sexual orientation, my ethnicity, and my race. But also where I live, the red circle is kind of talking to my geographic location, the income I earn, personal habits, religion, background, educational and other, work appearances, parental status, if I'm single or not. And together that kind of forms the dimensions of what makes up the individual culture. But looking broader, I'm an individual that works within an organization, and this organization has a personality and dimensions of its own. And that's kind of unpacked in the yellow circle, which is talking about functional level. Am I a manager? Am I, in this case, data scientist or data citizen? Do I work in a certain field? What's my division and department? What's the leadership like within that department? Seniority, work location, and so on. So when we're talking about how a person is going to respond ethically, all these dimensions make up the ingredients that direct the response. So just moving on from that, if we wanted to measure it, we would need to then measure it on a continuum. So specifically talking about data, which is the last two lines, we can't say it's not a clear black and white. It's determined on a continuum. And that continuum is generally talking about a trust versus distrust versus trust, or on this side, a disagreement versus agreement. And we're going to talk on the next slide a little bit more about this continuum and the different levels as we get to a higher order and drive towards knowledge. So let me just go right there. So what are we saying about this continuum and where do we find ourselves? Well, anything on the left of this line is about distrust and disagreement, as you can see here, from a -1 to a -4. This means that trust is not established at this stage, and we call it a data-disabled organization. Where I think we're wanting to strive is certainly, if we look at the blue arrows, become a knowledge-driven organization. But each of these and why they're steps, each step builds onto the next one. And so we go as we increase our maturity from a data-enabled to a knowledge-driven organization. So what is that progression that we're actually alluding to? And we're going to go in them in detail, and Costa's going to share examples, and Howard as well. And we would like your insights. Howard, I don't know if you want to take over from here.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I think if you click, there's just that left-hand slide. Yeah, okay. All right, so we see when we talk about this trust and agreement,
I can't switch it off.
the very first aspect that we want to discuss with you and also with your business is, how do you know that people appreciate the value of data? Now, the type of things that we can gauge it by is that if the organization starts to invest in the data management practices, sorry about that, they start to say, well, we've got to do better at this. We've got to invest in designing a data strategy and getting our data going. A lot of the times when I go into organizations, most of the businesses are dealing with that descriptive analytics, and they can, from a BI point of view, they can answer what happened. Most of the times they can answer what happened, but I found it in so many occasions that the business doesn't actually trust the definition of what has happened or what the BI is saying has happened. And they will do things like, instead of arguing with you, and now you can see this fear of conflict, instead of doing that, they will ask a friend and ask someone to confirm what that report has been saying. Okay, so we already see that instead of people questioning the numbers on the reports or doing something, they stop looking at it. And there's this one customer that I was really surprised by, where they felt that the numbers and the answers that they were getting in both the what and the why, or also at the forecasting, didn't meet their requirements and didn't have an understanding of what was going on in the economy and the world around them. Okay, so the very people that were producing it, when it got to a discussion on what decisions we should make, they really followed what the data was telling them. And when they were building the narrative, and this comes back to Martin's point earlier on, is that they were more focused on creating the narrative than they were on understanding the data. So they basically they got the data there, they brought it in with the latest set of figures, they then saw what the graph was saying, they felt that this wasn't a true reflection of what's going on, and they started to build narratives. And they started to adjust the original source, and so the focus was more on the narrative, on telling the stories of data, than it was about the data itself. And I find that we find ourselves in a very tricky element over there, and a lot of the times I'm not sure how many of us have got out of the data disabled. We may have got out of it in one or two areas, but in general, are the people looking at the data and listening to it and saying, if the forecast said that we are going to lose business, will they do something tomorrow about it? Are they changing their behavior? Now, I don't know about you guys, but how many times as data scientists, when we present these forecasts, and I've been involved in several of those situations where you're preparing a lot of the data, you're looking at the forecasts, and then you're hoping that when they make a decision or they respond to it, that the data is going to have some sway. And on several occasions, they felt that they don't believe that that's the truth of the matter and that's what's happening out there. And so they would like to adjust it. And the biggest problem that I find with that is, how do you as a data scientist, how do you counter that comment? So is there anybody that would like to share on that or pass any comments? Martin, I don't know, I see you were looking at some of that source. Is there any comments from you guys on how to deal with the situation of Are you truly data enabled? Do you truly trust the data? Because if you're not, you're never going to get to what we refer to as data-driven culture. Because each one of these steps are dependent on overcoming the problems on the previous step.
Yeah, hello, Maarten van der Heijden. My background is a study of history, and that is where this source criticism also comes from. It's
right.
about 150 years of thinking by historians that is gathered there, and as a historian, you never have complete data. So you have to explain to yourself and your environment why you can use the data you have. But that is also completely valid for the situation of advanced analytics. So also there, people have to understand, and the same accounts for BI environments.
Yes.
And it is very important to really look at which data you are using and why you can use that.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's very important. And so we are going to have naysayers that look at your graphs and saying, no, they don't believe it, they don't trust it. If you can't take it to that next level of being able to explain why you can use the data, you're never going to get past this data disabled state. Is that sort of what you're saying, Martin?
Indeed, yeah, and beyond the way of thinking of the historian and looking at the data and the data quality, there are many newer and more statistical based ideas about it. So, for instance, the survivor bias is a typical one. But there are more biases that you should prevent and address, and if possible, also discuss if you use data.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, and I've almost forgot to mention it. Is that a lot of the times when I look at data management and when I look at why some of the BI projects go wrong, and you do a quick profile from a quality point of view, and you just and you very structured in the way in which you assess the quality, the very process that you are following builds confidence and trust. So if you're doing that and you're saying, I've looked for the biases, this is the sort of thing that I've extracted, and I've made sure that we haven't dealt with that bias, that we have dealt with the bias, and I can look at reasonability responses within the answers as well. That's when people start feeling confident about your approach. If you're not demonstrating that level of thoroughness about almost the prevention of the problem and the understanding of the data behind it, data quality is used quite often, you're going to fail, and they're not going to have that trust. They're not going to be in agreement. You're constantly arguing and going on the fear of conflict, the lack of commitment, avoidance, and then they just stop taking responsibility for it. So that's all of almost the things that you need to start taking care of up front, the what and the why. And one of the things that I'm now trying to introduce in a few of my customers is that how do we go about being open and transparent about the algorithms and the validity of the algorithms that we use to develop more data, to give us the forecasting, to give us that insight? How do we go about it? And do we make almost an open public domain where people can see the code, they can validate the transformations, they can validate all the exclusions, they can check the quality of the data before you present a time series, or at the same time as presenting the time series, so that you can show to them, when I build this time series, here is what the quality of my data is across the different dimensions that they understand, and what you've done in terms of excluding certain elements of the data. So I think it's these fundamental steps that we have to get right before we can ask people to be led by data.
Yeah, and I believe it is important to stress that the algorithms are never biased.
Yes, yes.
Algorithms don't have a bias. That's in
Yes.
our minds. It's people. So
Yes.
it's us at the time we create the data. It's us at the time we interpret the usability of the data, and it's us at the moment we interpret the results.
Right. So the one area that I found, Martin, is I've been working with quite a few actuaries and statisticians, and where they find it helpful is that they would look at the different set of algorithms that could be applied and what the different algorithms would produce to be able to give confidence. You're 100% correct. The math of the algorithm is not biased. But sometimes the correct or the incorrect application of certain algorithms will give you the different answers that you're not looking for. And it's to almost demonstrate to them that you've taken care of that, and this is the reason for applying that approach, and these are the answers that you're getting from that. Okay. Any other questions? Anybody else would like to? Please, guys, if you want to ask the questions, I think it's important that
Howard,
we.
yes.
Yes, Paul.
I perhaps misheard, therefore misunderstanding, just your comment around the focus more on the narrative versus the data.
Yeah.
And that's why I say maybe I misheard, and therefore I'm misunderstanding. If you could just maybe go back to that point and just give help with a practical, what do you mean by they focus on the narrative versus the data when they're distrusting? Thanks.
So no. What I think has been said is that when the scientists have done they've run all the data and things like that, and they've built the time series and scenarios like that, and they feel that the narrative is not strong enough. And I'll use this one experience that I had with some actuaries and statisticians. They said to me, "Are you not aware of the process we use? We beat the data until it confesses." Meaning, I've got a story to tell, and this is what we believe we should be telling, and I will make the data tell that story.
Okay, got it. Okay.
And I actually, with one of the customers I've worked with, and they realized that this has been a problem, we went back and said, okay, we got to look almost 2 years back in terms of the lead up. And unfortunately, what people had done, they had provided, they actually, I like the word, they call it judgments. And they added judgments to the data. But unfortunately, they overwrote the original data. So we weren't sure what the real data was and what the judgment was. We couldn't discern how much judgment had been added.
Okay.
So you see data, and if you're naive and things like that, you can actually almost believe it, and you think that that's really what the data is saying. But there's a lot of storytelling behind that, and sometimes that storytelling goes a bit too far.
Got you. So just maybe a question there, even though, just as a scenario, even though your data is sitting at a data-led or a data-driven state, can the person or the interpreter still drive the narrative they want?
I think once you're getting past the what and why and what will happen, and I know Costa is going to start sharing some stories on the what will happen.
Okay.
The narrative starts to become back to the data and what is the data telling us, and then also that last step which we talk about, what don't I know, and if so, the data's got to be aware of what it knows and what it doesn't know to be able to discern what you don't know. And so you've got to build this up one step at a time, and it's that feedback loop where the answers of the why and the what will happen feed into the what to do and what don't I know. So if you start twisting it at the bottom, your answers at the top are really twisted.
It was just really triggered from what Martin said about the algorithm not having a bias, but we do.
Yes.
And although the data is telling the truth or is trustworthy, and the next person could rely on it, I could still try and drive my view of this world. But
100%. And that's sort of what Christine was saying in terms of that culture. Guys, we're not just affected by the data, we're affected by our current state, the external environment that we live in. And so there's all sorts of drivers for us to behave in a way different to what the data is saying. Now, I think the first thing is to get a credible source of data that everyone says, I buy that data. And if you're not doing the necessary homework to get people to buy into the data, into that original definition, well, then it's open for all sorts of discussions.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. So I've basically spoken about the what and why on the data quality and the integrity of the code that's been used. And we're seeing so many of the latest economics and things like that, all these code books, the Jupyter code books, where they're asking you to store the data plus the algorithms plus all the paradata or the metadata in terms of what exclusions, what transformations happened, so people can go and pick it to pieces and pick it apart to see where it may have gone wrong. We've made the wrong discussion. Okay. Now, the next 3 is really where we start delving into the meaning and starting to understand a little bit more about the meaning. And this is sort of the area that we bring Costa in. Costa, would you like me to explain a little bit more, or are you comfortable with taking it from here?
I'm fine, Howard. You can, let's just look at the next slide. We can talk to, do you want me to, let me talk to this proportionality maybe and the duty of care.
Yeah. So maybe that's a good question to ask the people here is, how many people don't understand what the ethical term is, duty of care? Is everyone comfortable with what the duty of care is? And I always find a way of, I can certainly ask one of you to explain.
Okay, there are lots of hands up.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't. Okay. So, Loretta, are you saying you're not sure about duty of care, or are you saying that you do understand duty of care?
I don't, and I'd love an explanation, please.
Okay, fantastic. So I think that's a good place to start. Costa, will you explain what that means?
I'm gonna position duty of care in terms of all the ethical normative theories, and then look at all of them, look at the Western-centered ethical theories, and then introduce an African philosophy of Ubuntu. So if we could look at that slide first, and then we can go back to see it and try and make duty of care real and give some concrete examples.
Fantastic.
So, I just wanted to position it in terms of the other ethical theories. Okay, not this one. Let's go to.
Wait, let me just see. This is okay. Let me just do presentation mode again.
Okay.
Sorry,
just give us a sec and we'll get there.
Resume slideshow. Your top left-hand corner is resume slideshow. There we go. Okay.
Can you see it?
Yeah,
there we go.
Okay, here we are. Sorry about that slight delay there. It's not, Mercury hasn't gone retrograde. Right, let's have the whole slide here. Okay, let's look at duty of care. So it goes back to deontology, the duty-based ethical theory of Immanuel Kant. These are Western theories really based on the duties of the individual and as a person. On the right, we have the Greeks with virtue ethics, more about excellence of character and what that looks like. And on the left, we have the utilitarian of John Stuart Mill about, maximizing good for the greatest number, for maximum sort of utility. And then I'd like to bring in Ubuntu, bring the African philosophy of Ubuntu that's very human-centered. And Ubuntu really has features that cover these theories, ethical theories, but it's very community-centered, consensus-centered, and human-centered. And we can look at some key features of Ubuntu and how it's relevant to our data scientists in having a a data culture that's more people-centered or human-centered rather than individualistic. But duty of care, really, it comes under things like exercising goodwill, not using people as an instrument or a means to an end. And if we bring Ubuntu into it, it's not about being egoistic and individualistic as we had some of the sort of more traditional Western approach. There's also the ethic of care, and Ubuntu also ties into that, about the community. So whether I'm a community at work, the internal stakeholders at work, there's a duty of care in what I do, but also the impact it has on my community, on the outside society. That's really where duty of care, the duty of care comes into it. And it brings in concepts like beneficence and non-maleficence, that I mustn't do harm to others and maximize the goods. That whatever we do, whatever we work on must have some social good, must benefit people and society. So beneficence as a principle comes into it. We really need to avoid harm from malicious or unexpected uses, and it mustn't be to the detriment of people. And where Ubuntu comes in again is it has to be collaborative. And the Ubuntu principles, there's always collaboration and there's always community minded, because community is about social harmony, and we really have to have the community. And what does that mean? Again, it's bringing people back into the loop. So if we look at it here and if we look at it in terms of the trust thing, the basic motivation for ethical conduct is, say, the contracts on the right, so the contract rights-based one. Here, that's a minimum moral standard for motivation. And the law has certain limitations. And Howard, we were talking earlier before we started about the issue of consent. And I think a key takeaway is the issue of consent. We need to talk about consent and legitimate interest. And we were talking about, legitimate interest when we're processing and we just look at the law, we look at the regulations like papaya. The law sets a minimum standard, and it says, we'll have the lawyers coming in and arguing that you have a lawful interest. If you look at papaya, it says there has to be lawfulness, and it mustn't be unnecessary processing. So lawfulness comes into the equation, but that's not enough, because the lawyer will argue, well, you have a lawful interest to process the data because it has some kind of commercial value, so you don't need consent of the data subject. But we both agree that that's not enough. Because if we bring Ubuntu and duty of care back into it, which is people and customer-centered and community-centered, then that brings us to consent. We realize then the consent of the data subject is critical. And we need to engage more with the data subject and put more effort into engaging and getting the views of the data subject. So consent is essential, and it all ties up with duty of care, and then the principle of proportionality. So it's a new principle.
Sorry, Costa. Maybe I can just get a little bit more in terms of practical there, because I think this is a really important point. I think last week we had the debate about clearly explaining to people what's the difference between privacy and the difference between ethics. How would we explain it to a CEO? And we had quite a few discussions, but if we look at our both GDPR and Papaya, and I actually presented on this yesterday, where we put a data model down next to our, we call it the ROPA, which is the Registry of Processing Activities. And if you remember, we found a problem with one of the areas on the data model to say the consent, whether we needed to get consent. Now, a lot of companies, to get through the Papaya processing, they will avoid asking the people for consent, asking data subjects for consent, and they will tend and drift towards saying that they have a lawful reason for it or a legitimate interest in it.
Right.
Okay, so most of them will try to pass the appropriate privacy laws by contractual rights.
Yes.
Now, if you were to go back to the CEO or someone like that and to say, we feel that we need to go and ask all the customers whether we have the consent to do this processing, how many of you guys think that you're going to get the answer back to say, that's a good idea, let's go and ask everybody if we can process their data?
Zero.
Knowing
Nobody.
that, yeah, I mean, how many of you guys have done that in your approach to Papaya, is saying we're not just going to hide behind the lawyers and the law to say that this is okay. We are now going to take it back to our customers and say, do you consent? And not only that, you can withdraw your consent at any time. So how many of us, from a data science point of view and from a company point of view, that we get presented this data, how many of us are willing to take that chance? And we feel that's almost your difference between taking a contractual privacy approach to it, or a duty to others to go back to them and say, is this right for you? Are you getting the right things out of this processing that I'm applying here? And as an example, if I'm selling your names to certain retailers to contact you, is that right? Are you comfortable with that? Certainly, I haven't been approached. I don't know if any of you guys have taken this approach in any of your companies. Is there anyone that's happy to share a story, knowing that it's been recorded?
Well, I won't divulge the company details, but from our side, yes, that was the approach that we were taking, where we started by identifying like these subject matters, and for us to be in a position to go and request them for their consent. So we
Okay.
even went through that route when we were dealing with the GDPR.
Okay, and how did it go? How were you able to get contact with all the people and ask them for that consent?
No, so actually, some of them, we actually found that the data was already outdated. So
Okay.
now it's a matter of like that you're sitting, like you're idling, you don't even know how to move forward.
Right. And,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think that's actually quite nice in a way, is that you're probably putting the data under a level of testing that it hasn't been tested before.
The other issue that I actually wanted to raise also is the one that we saw recently of Facebook, where Facebook was now, or even not WhatsApp, yeah, WhatsApp was forcing people to give consent to Facebook, and it was a matter of take it or leave it, while the approach in different countries, say the European country, the approach was not the same. So in such instances, how would you advise the companies?
Yeah, I think there was some bad communication techniques that they've applied, and they didn't communicate very well. But the interesting thing about that, and I'm open to correction, but my understanding was, when I read more and more of the details, are you aware that Apple is now forcing certain transparency of the applications running on iOS and situations like that? Now, for WhatsApp to run on iOS, it actually has to publish that it's doing these things with your data that they weren't doing in the past. So
Yes.
it was an interesting discussion that came about with, it was almost iOS forcing WhatsApp to admit to what they were doing with the data and what they were going to do with the business side of it when they started allowing businesses to transact and get data. And so they had to now come out into the open and say, these are all the data elements we're keeping. If you don't like it, you got to leave. They didn't do it in the best way. They could have done it a whole lot nicer, but they were almost driven to that point. And unfortunately, it was coming from the right background, but the way in which they handled it was they could have done it a lot better.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually. Nice.
Yeah, they were actually forced to now be more transparent, and they should have handled it in a more appropriate way and said, we're coming back to you, this is what we want to do, but they just basically said, take it or leave it. And I think they were running out of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's sort of what we're going to have with the papaya. When we run out of time, everything's going to be a lawful requirement or legitimate interest. Costa, anything from your side on? Sorry?
First Brand is already forcing us down that route, whereby
Yes.
they're saying generating the first ID or whatever, and everyone within that umbrella will get access to your data.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. It's nice that we're becoming aware of it, but I think that we need a bit of shining up on our communication plans. Christine?
Yes, that's also no small feat, because it's got to be stakeholder related, it's not just,
And there was a really nice, I think Caroline Mouton on the privacy shared the difference between the way Liberty Life dealt with their breach and the way that Experian dealt with their breach. Experian kept on adjusting their answers and telling different stories, whereas Liberty was consistent from the get-go. This is what's happened, this is the situation and this is what we're doing about it. And Experian was saying, oh, we can't talk to you now, we got to this, and then the distrust started to build. Unfortunately, it was more a case of bad communication.
Yeah.
Costa?
Yeah, I just want to go back to privacy and consent, and I'm influenced more by the human rights school, and I think going forward, it's a higher order ethical thinking, and it may be at this stage it's maybe a bridge too far, but I think we need to cross that bridge. And I think privacy is the minimum standard, and almost like a default position. So that's an easy one.
Yep.
But consent, I think increasingly, my view, obviously there are commercial interests here that have to be balanced. I think consent will have to become the default position. Whether it's inconvenient or uncomfortable or whatever, but I certainly think from a customer-centered point of view and a human rights point of view, companies have a lot of power, and there's a big impact with AI and all these sort of technologies that are taking place. And I mean, even with AI, there's so much out there that it becomes tricky, because with the facial recognition, the darlings, the startup companies that are dealing with facial recognition, and the venture capitalists love them. But there's proprietary interest there in sort of, they protect, their methods or their technology, the machine under the hood is protected, but it's still going to have an impact on human beings. So we have a right to know, and to be, they're going to have to reach out to people and get people as part of the process. So
what about the Chinese government and facial recognition? It's another example. There was a good example about the Chinese government and facial recognition, and how they used that to keep their citizens at bay, so that they couldn't go out without freedom of speech. So they used it to kind of put a stop on their travel.
Well, I think they were linking it to whether people could buy airline tickets to travel.
Yeah.
And I think that's where there's also the risk of, then there comes the risk of political subversion, but that's a different issue. That's another issue. But I feel strongly, I think I'm leaning towards consent. I
think it's an important point where we talk about the pandemic and things like that, where we have lives versus livelihood. And there is that discussion, Costa, that I think you talk about it somewhere else, proportionality or things like that.
Yes.
I think
proportionality.
There's a slide.
We can bring up. Yeah, there is a slide, but it goes to the legitimacy, credibility, and proportionality. All these things, I think, go to legitimacy and credibility with the public and with people. And the proportionality example, so that's a principle. It's a universal principle that's it's not in Papaya and GDPR, but it comes from bioethics. And proportionality is really that you cannot have the data project must be linked. It cannot be disproportionate in the ethical sense. So we used the example even last week about a patient's medical records and their location history, linking a patient's medical records to their location history, their activity tracking, and looking at social media, so that you could maybe make better exercise recommendations. That was the benefit. So that was positioned that way. but there's a definite risk here of re-identification, and here it goes to loss of privacy, and the negative outcomes could be very high. So this is definitely disproportionate in the ethical sense. And this is much wider again. The disproportionality in the ethical sense is the bar set much higher, and it's a much wider than regulation in the legal sense.
Right.
Then legitimacy and credibility. I don't know if you want to. I give you another example there.
Yeah.
With algorithms making the decisions and bringing the human into the loop. This is a recent example in the summer. This is with COVID, where schools in the UK were criticized during the summer because they cancelled exams because of COVID, but they still needed to grade the students. So they tried to predict and award grades based on teachers' assessments that they'd done in previous years. And this didn't really work out well, and there was a huge public outcry about fairness and about bias, and it was not based on merit. And here again, the system wasn't tested. So here, clearly the data and the way people are sort of, the people before the data, it underpins the problem, where a systemic bias was baked in based on race, gender, or address that predicted grades that was unfair. Again, this went to transparency, where, what does the algorithm look like? What does the machine look like under the hood? And, what sort of governance structures were put into place here? And this goes directly to public trust and to legitimacy and credibility when you get it wrong.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was that lovely example of, I think that the kid in Soweto that I think got 9 distinctions or something like that. They got 100% for maths and physics, and the guy was operating in conditions that the machine would never grant that level of achievement to someone in those conditions. It's just, it's a complete, the person was able to achieve so much more than anybody else around him, and even the people in good conditions. So how does the machine handle that sort of scenario, and how do we come up with it?
Good. So I think to make it real for our audience is really to think about duty of care, to think about accountability. Accountability in the regulations means strict liability, but accountability, let's say in Ubuntu, is more about taking ownership as a group. Again, to bring in the group moderation, not the individual making the decision. We have group collaboration, group consensus, and that means accountability in the Ubuntu sense. So for the group, maybe as data scientists, to think of what does duty of care look like in my job, in my day-to-day activities, accountability look like, and what is my ethical responsibility? Because ethical responsibility goes beyond just the ethics officer or the CDO or the CEO. It's every single person has to have that conversation and have that safe environment where these concerns, if you feel uncomfortable about something, you're not sure, that these discussions have to take place. They have to be vented, they have to be aired. And that's what ethics about. It's about having the conversation and asking those questions all the time. And always with the aim of putting the person into the process. People before and people after, at every step of the way. And that's where I think Ubuntu has valuable lessons and principles that can guide us, because Ubuntu is all about respect and goodwill, and thinking about in terms of shared identity. It really promotes team participation and inclusivity, and removes that reliance on the individual, where you could have that inherent bias and blind spot. So that diversity in thinking becomes important, so that we can exercise that respect, because Ubuntu is very strong on showing I am a person through another person is the definition. So that's about respecting the other person and exercising goodwill along the way. And that's how you create social harmony, you create trust. Mutual respect and trust creates that kind of social harmony in the Ubuntu sense, by being more engaging and more open.
So if I look at the slide in that collaboration, is team consensus sufficient, or do you require community consensus as well?
Yeah, it's only one part, actually, Howard. It's a good question, because team consensus, that's the internal stakeholders.
Yeah,
But-
I'm being driven by my.
Ubuntu requires that you look at the goodwill, the welfare of your community. So you've got to go much wider than internal, what's good for the company. You have a responsibility to look at your outside community as well. And that's why it's more sort of more far-reaching than just internal stakeholders. You have to engage with your external stakeholders.
Okay, so let me ask a question here. I mean, I know it's hard enough for us to get consensus within a team, within an organization. Now we're going to open up to the community. Do we ever get any projects going forward?
Yeah, it does slow down. There's a legitimate concern that it slows down the process,
Yeah.
but it can slow down things. But you know, are you going to be how are you going to be customer centric and user friendly and customer facing if you don't engage with your community, your external stakeholders?
Yes, so what you're saying is that if I don't have a person on the team or within the team that is spending time with the community, that can be the voice of the community, then you're never going to get this right.
Exactly. You need to have that feedback. And I mean, we have the examples with, you know, there's so many examples where teachers were fired, but they weren't given reasons. There was no feedback. Okay, that's an internal situation. There's always this problem of feedback. If you need feedback and engagement goes to legitimacy and credibility. Otherwise, it's going to be questioned. And the public is becoming more aware, and the public does have a right to have answers and be consulted.
So maybe just to ask the guys on the talk, how many people are actually soliciting feedback within their systems to ensure that the data can be balanced? Is that sort of what you're referring to? Am I correct?
Yes.
So how many systems have this incorporated into them? And then how do we know that we're getting the right truth from that feedback? Are none of us looking at it? Is that sort of the situation we're in?
So Howard, maybe this is something to do with, you know, when we look at algorithms and the power they have, it's about predictability. Obviously, is a big issue. You know, the predictability, but then also the accuracy. So we have to start developing systems that are high on accuracy and predictability. Because if we're going to engage, you brought up the question of the sociological survey. You know, this is a challenge of how to increase accuracy and predictability, the accuracy of the predictability that we're going to put out there. But then by, you know, using it to get that feedback, but it has to be accurate feedback, reliable feedback.
Right.
If we're going to use it to predict what the public and what the community is thinking.
Yeah.
Because accuracy, predictive AI for everybody. I mean, I'm not an AI expert or a technology person. I'm an ethics guy. I have to put on my philosopher's hat, not my lawyer's hat. And the North Star of AI is to be predictive, right? I mean, everyone seems to agree with that.
Yeah.
We want greater predictability, but it's
greater
no
insight,
good if it's
understanding of what we should do.
No, sorry?
It's greater insights and an understanding of what we should do. So we're looking for those recommendations. We're looking for things that we can't answer.
Correct. Now, engaging with our external community, we want it to be accurate, to give us an accurate assessment of what the thinking is out there, to get that feedback, to inform our decisions. So we get more buy-in and you know, more legitimacy and credibility. So that's the challenge that AI has to answer.
So Mark's put a comment in the chat to say, one example, peer review of a drilling program proposal in an oil company. One geologist will propose and the rest of the team will ask questions. So it's almost, I think I also had that sort of thing of people playing different roles, and then that interrogation of what are our motives and why are we trying to do this? Before we make too many of the committing to the data and looking for the correlations and stuff like that.
Yeah.
All right. Costa, anything more you'd like to say? I think we've come to an end. Or is there
No, I
something?
think we've covered it. Really, we've said it before. Ethics has to be rolled out at every level. It's a conversation that's ongoing. It's difficult. There are grey areas. It's not clear cut always, so it's not easy. It's not something that's very easy. Law deals with the facts, but you almost have to move beyond the facts, because the facts is part of it, but you have to rise above the facts, and there's a higher order thinking here. So
And I think that's also, I think what we're also saying there is, when you're dealing with stuff that you don't know about, yeah, you probably don't have an understanding of the outcome, but you need to put in proactive measures to ensure that you are following what the potential results are of what you're doing.
100% right. I agree with you on proactive, because we know what happens when we're reactive. When you're reactive and the damage is done, then you've got the cost, the reputational damage, all the harm that's caused. So proactive when it comes to privacy, proactive, I think consent proactive along the way, absolutely.
Right.
Great, guys. Thank you very much. Howard, Christine, Costa, everybody's questions, everybody's comments. Thank you very much for your time. As mentioned up front, if you'd like a copy of the recording to go through it again, or maybe you had to leave at 5 sharp, there's a few comments and discussion points that you missed. Please drop us a note on LinkedIn and we'll be sure to send you the link. Hope everybody has an awesome evening, and see you next week. Same time, same place.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you,
Thank you,
guys.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
Bye.
Bye-bye.
much. Bye.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Bye.